The first time he saw the mountains of Alaska rise like frozen waves against the horizon, he thought no human soul could possibly belong there. The peaks looked like the bones of the earth itself, half buried beneath centuries of ice silence, holding secrets older than memory. Yet somewhere deep he knew that this was where he would end. The wind cut sharp against his face as he watched the sunlight scatter over the ridges, each glint of ice flickering like a distant fire. For most men, the cold was a reason to retreat. For him, it was a reason to stay. The mountain didn't invite comfort. It demanded respect, and he respected few things left in the world more than that. He had come north with little more than a pack, a worn coat, and a quiet need to disappear. In the small harbor town where the frozen road ended, the locals had told him stories about how the native people once built shelters that could survive even the rage of the avalanche. At first, he thought it was myth, one of those tales told to strangers to keep them humble before they faced the mountain. But the longer he stayed, the more he saw that every story had a shadow of truth, and every shadow here, body. The old men at the docks would shake their heads when they spoke of it, saying the settlers never believed what they said. They thought it was impossible that something made of earth, snow, and driftwood could withstand the crush of half a mountain. But the natives didn't build against nature. They built with her, and that made all the... He would learn that truth the hard way. In the early days, before the first true storm arrived, he watched the light change hour by hour and wondered what kind of man it took to call such a place home. There were no straight lines here, no soft edges, no easy morning. Every sound was clear enough to cut through bone. The call of a raven, the groan of ice shifting under the weight of its own frozen age, the whisper of the wind as it searched the valley. He would stand for hours outside his makeshift shelter, his breath turning to clouds in front of him, and think about how little man really knew about endurance. We build our walls too thin, our hearts too restless, our shelters too proud to bend when the world presses down. But the natives knew that the secret survival strength, harmony. He met an old native man once, a hunter who had lived through more winters than anyone could count. The man's face was stone, his eyes reflecting the same calm the mountains carried. He spoke slowly, without hurry, as though words themselves had earned their place in the air. When asked about the shelters, he smiled and said something that stayed with him forever. A house that fights the mountain will die with it. A house that bows to the mountain will live. At first, the settler didn't understand. But later, when the first avalanche came roaring down like thunder trapped in snow, he finally did. The man built his first shelter the way he had learned from books and memory. Walls too stiff, roof too proud, corners too sharp. The snow pressed and broke it like paper. It wasn't the wind that failed him, but his own stubbornness, the same arrogance that made so many settlers perish before they ever truly saw the land for what it was. He rebuilt, slower this time, softer, listening to what the old man had said. He packed snow not in defiance, but in layers that curved like the hills themselves. He buried his shelter deeper into the slope, shaping it into the mountain's own rhythm. And when the next storm came, the shelter held, not because it resisted the mountain, but because it became part of it. He began to understand that survival in Alaska was not about conquering nature. It was about surrendering to it in the right way. Every structure the natives built carried that same wisdom. The settlers had their axes and saws, their imported planks, and their square rooms. The natives had snow, moss, bone, and time. They built low, so the wind passed over them instead of through them. They built curved, so the weight of snow pressed evenly and did not crush. They built deep, so the warmth of the earth could be trapped inside. To outsiders, these shelters looked primitive, temporary, like something that could be swept away in a single night. Yet they stood long after the cabins of settlers rotted into dust. He spent that first winter alone, learning what silence truly meant. Silence in the mountains is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of stillness so complete that it humbles everything noisy inside you. Some nights he could hear the snow settle, a slow sigh across the valley. Other nights he heard the cracks of ice shifting under unseen pressure, like the groaning of ancient timbers deep beneath the surface. There was no comfort, only truth. And yet, the first time in years he thought often of those early settlers who couldn't believe what they saw. They had come with dreams of gold, timber, of farms, and families, of bringing civilization into the wilderness. But the wilderness bent easily. Many of them built tall cabins with thick logs and heavy roofs, proud symbols of man's defiance. When the avalanches came, those cabins splintered under the weight of the mountain's patience. The snow doesn't hurry. It builds quietly, grain by grain, until it remembers that gravity exists. Then it falls, without anger, without mercy. It is not a punishment. It is simply the mountain remembering that nothing stands above it. The native shelters, by contrast, vanished beneath the snow and reappeared when the thaw came, intact, unchanged. The settlers couldn't believe it. They said it was witchcraft or luck, but it was neither. It was understanding, something most men lose. They start thinking they are greater than the earth that holds. The old hunter had said that the mountain doesn't take live, it takes lesson. Those who listen live to tell them. Those who don't become part of the silence. In those long winter months, the man learned the mountain doesn't reward bravery or rewards humility. You bow to its wind, you yield to its rhythm, and it allows you to stay. That the only bargain it offers. He began to see the land not as a threat, but as a teacher, one that spoke in storms and silence instead of words. He started to rebuild his shelter again, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to understand it. Each layer of snow he packed with sentence, each curve of ice a memory. He realized that even the smallest detail, the way you place a stone, the angle of an entrance, the shape of a wall, could mean the difference between warmth and death. And in that understanding, he found something like reverence. The settlers who came after him often asked how he survived so long up there, how he could live through winters that broke men twice his size. He would tell them it wasn't about strength nor about knowledge, but about listening. They rarely understood. People from the cities think survival is about tools and tricks, but survival in the mountains is about surrender. You cannot outthink a storm. You can only prepare to meet it as an equal. The native people knew that long before any outsider arrived. Their shelters were not shelters. They were extensions of themselves, shaped by patience, memory, and respect. As the days stretched into months, and the months blurred into one long, endless white, he began to lose the sense of time altogether. The world outside became of light, shadow, the sun rising and falling behind the same silent peaks. He never felt trapped. The mountain was not a prison. It was a mirror. It showed him what remained when everything else. In the stillness, he began to see how fragile the lives of men had become, how much noise we need just to convince ourselves we're alive. Out here, there was only breath, wind, and the slow rhythm of snow against the roof. Sometimes, when he sat by the small fire, he would think of the people watching the storms from their windows far away, wondering how anyone could survive in such a place. He would smile, knowing they would never understand. The mountain doesn't need to be survived. It needs to be respected. And in that respect, you find something greater than comfort. You find belonging. If you've ever stood before a landscape that made you feel both small and infinite, if you've ever watched the world go quiet and felt something deep inside you, answer, then you already know a little of what the mountain speaks the same language to all who listen. Tell me, where are you watching this from? I'd like to know where wind reaches you tonight. He hadn't always been a man of silence. Before the mountain, the long winters and the frozen nights, he had lived among noise, the kind that fills every corner of life until you forget what peace sounds like. He came from a town where time moved too quickly, where men chased after wealth like it was air, and where even the quiet moments were crowded with worry. He used to believe success was measured by movement, the only proof of living, constant doing. But life has a way of teaching lessons you don't ask for, and his came in the form of loss so deep it hollowed him from the inside. There had been someone once, a woman who saw in him what he himself had forgotten, a gentleness buried beneath the need to prove something. She loved the calm in him that he rarely allowed to surface, and he loved her laughter because it sounded like home. They built a small life together, nothing grand, feel full. Yet even fullness can be fragile when the world around you keeps demanding more. Work took him away for longer stretches. Promises began to feel like debts, and the space between them widened like cracks in frozen earth. Then one winter, she fell ill, and he wasn't there. By the time he returned, the bed was empty, and the silence that met him was different from the silence of the mountain. It was the kind that follows you wherever you go. He stayed in that house for months after, wandering through it as though she might return if he just waited long enough. But grief doesn't fade where it's born. It needs distant emptiness, something larger than pain, to hold it. That was when he began thinking of Alaska, not as an escape, but as a return. He had seen photographs once, the kind where the horizon looked endless, and the air so clear you could almost see eternity bending. It felt like the only place big enough to carry what he couldn't. So one morning, without telling anyone, he packed his things and drove north until the road ended, sky turned to steel. People in the harbor town looked at him the way they always look at men running from ghosts, with a mix of pity and curiosity. They didn't ask questions. The mountain usually answers them sooner or later. The locals knew that everyone who comes to Alaska is either chasing something or burying it. Some run from the law, others from themselves. A few come because they've heard the silence there can heal. But the silence doesn't heal anything. It only strips away the noise that hides what you really are. He didn't know that yet. He thought distance could save him. The mountain would offer peace climbed. But peace doesn't come from distance. It comes from surrender. And surrender takes the first months the hardest. The loneliness felt alive, like something with weight. Every sound startled him. The crack of wood, the whisper of snow, even his own breathing. He realized how little space he had ever shared with himself. Back home, there was always to fill the hour, a voice. Out here, there was only time, and time can be a cruel companion when you have nowhere. He began to speak, not out of madness, to remember words like in the air. Some nights he talked to her as though she could hear him across the frozen miles, telling her about the stars and the strange calm of the wind. In those moments, he almost believed she could. Then came the first real storm. It arrived without warning, sweeping down from the peaks, a living thing. The wind howled so violently that the trees bent nearly in half, and the snow fell so thick he couldn't see his own hand. His shelter shook, and he thought he would die there, buried beneath his own mistake. But when morning came, the storm had passed, and the sun broke through in quiet triumph. The air glittered with ice crystals, and the world looked reborn. He stepped outside and realized that everything he thought he knew about control, meaningless here. The mountain didn't care who he was, what he'd lost, why he came. It simply existed, and for him to live there, he would have to exist with it. That was the first time he felt something close to acceptance, not of the mountain, but of himself. In town, before he left for good, one of the elders had told him that the mountain never takes without giving. You just have to learn to see what give. At first, he thought it meant food or shelter or safety. Later, he understood it meant understanding. The longer he lived there, the more he saw how everything connected. The way wind carved the ridges, the way snow insulated life instead of killing it, the way animals followed ancient paths never failed them. He began to build habits the way the natives did, not out of superstition, respect. He stopped cutting more wood than he needed. He stopped hunting more than he could eat. He learned that gratitude was a kind of warmth, too. Sometimes, when the sky turned pink at dusk and the whole valley glowed, he would feel her presence again, not as memory, as part of the landscape itself. He started to think maybe she hadn't left him, not really. Maybe she had just become part of the stillness, part of the cold light that touched everything at once. The pain never disappeared, but it softened like snow melting beneath sunlight. He began to see that the mountain wasn't punishment. It was redemption in disguise. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave him a place to understand it, and that was enough. He met the old native hunter a few months after that storm, the same man who later taught him how to build a shelter that could survive the avalanche. The hunter didn't ask why he was there. He simply nodded as if he already knew. They spent long days through the forest, the old man pointing out tracks, explaining which trees whispered when storms were coming, how the ravens spoke to each other when danger was near. The settler listened like a child. He realized the hunter wasn't just teaching him survival. He was teaching him humility. When you walk through the forest, you are a guest. If you stay too long, take too much, speak too loud, the mountain will remember. That sentence stayed with him for years. Through those teachings, he came to understand that his isolation wasn't exile. It was invitation. The mountain wasn't pushing him away from the world. It was drawing him deeper into it. Every sound, every shift of wind, every shadow on the snow became part of a conversation older than any language. He stopped trying to fill the silence and began to listen. And in listening, he heard his own heart again. That was when he knew the mountain had become both his punishment and his forgiveness. Years later, when travelers or trappers passed through and asked why he stayed, he would tell them the truth, though few understood it. "You come here to survive," he said, "but you stay to be reborn." Most of them laughed or shook their heads, thinking he had gone mad from solitude. But he wasn't mad. He had simply learned that peace and loneliness are not enemies. They are two sides of the same mountain. He began keeping small tokens of his journey. Stones he found at sunrise, pieces of driftwood carved smooth by the river, feathers caught in the snow. He kept them in a small pouch beside his bed, not as decoration, but as reminders that beauty didn't need to be loud to be seen. Each token marked a moment of surrender, a lesson learned in silence. He no longer needed the noise of the world to feel alive. The sound of wind through the pines and the crunch of snow beneath his boots was enough. Even the heartbeat of the earth beneath him was enough. In the evenings, as the light faded and the temperature dropped, he would sit beside the small fire and remember the town, the people, the life he had left behind. He didn't feel regret, only gratitude. The world had given him everything it could, and when he could no longer carry it, it had shown him where to rest. He knew now that he hadn't escaped life. He had simply found the part of it that most people spend their whole lives chasing and never reach. Stillness. The mountain didn't give it easily, but nothing worth keeping ever comes without cost. Sometimes, in his dreams, he would see the settlers of long ago, their faces pale with disbelief as they watched native shelters rise snow after an avalanche. He could almost hear their voices. How could such fragile structures survive when their strong ones fell? And he would whisper to them in the dream, "Because you built to resist, not to belong." He had once been like them, proud, restless, sure that endurance was the same as control. Now he knew better. True endurance is not fighting against the storm, but breathing within it. He often thought of the old hunter who had long since passed into the earth he loved. He imagined his spirit moving through the valley, teaching others as he had taught him, unseen but always present. When the wind came down the slopes with that low humming sound, he liked to believe it was the hunter's voice, reminding him that he was never alone, not in the way. There were days when he wondered what had become of the world he'd left behind. Cities, the noise, the people, always rushing toward something they couldn't name. But he never wished to return. He had found what they were all searching for without knowing it. In the mountain silence, he found meaning. And once you've tasted that kind of peace, the world's noise feels unbearable. If you're hearing this and wondering what kind of man leaves everything behind just to find silence, maybe the question isn't why he left, but what you might find if you did the same. Maybe your mountain isn't made of snow and stone. Maybe it's a decision, a dream, or a truth afraid to. Whatever it is, know this: the mountain never takes without giving. Sometimes it just takes what you no longer need. And if this story finds you somewhere far from the cold, somewhere between your own storms and your own quiet, take a moment to breathe. You don't have to climb to the top to see clearly. Sometimes standing still is enough. And while you're here with me in this silence, take a moment to subscribe, to stay close, because the mountain still has much more to tell. By the time the third winter came, the silence no longer frightened him. It had become his language, his companion, the invisible breath that shared his days. He woke before the light, when the cold was at its sharpest and the stars still burned above the white valley, and for a few long minutes he would listen. The world was never truly silent. It spoke in the creak of frozen trees, slow of wind that rolled through the ridges, in the faint cracking of on the river far below. To the untrained ear, it was emptiness. To him, it was a song, the oldest one he had ever known. He had learned to hear meaning in every sound, and that quiet symphony became his sense of belonging. The rhythm of life in the mountain was nothing like the world below. There were no schedules, no rush. The days were measured by the shifting of light and the needs of survival. When the sun lingered low on the horizon, in long blue shadows across the snow, it meant the cold would deepen. When the ravens circled high above, their calls and wrestling, it meant a storm was coming. He had stopped counting days long ago. Instead, he marked time by moments of first frost, the first tracks of fox near the sound of dripping from the spring. The mountain taught him that time was not something to be conquered, but something to be shared. He had become part of the landscape in ways he never expected. His footprints traced the same paths as the wolves. His firelight flickered through the trees like the glow of distance. He moved slowly, deliberately, understanding that haste form of arrogance here. The animals never hurried. The rivers never rushed. Even death came without cruelty, just a quiet shift from one form to. Sometimes he found the remains of creatures buried in the snow, a bird, a hare, a fox, and he would stop to look at them with reverence. There was no tragedy in their stillness, only completion. The mountain didn't mourn. It transformed. In those long months of quiet, his thoughts began to soften. The edges of grief wore down until came and memory came. He thought often gentle of the woman he had lost, not with pain, but with gratitude. She had been the first to teach him stillness of her meaning. He realized now that her absence had been his beginning. Without that loss, he would never have known the fullness of silence. He sometimes spoke to her when he was alone by the fire, telling her about the birds that nested in the cliff, about the scent of pine after a storm, about the feeling of snow melting on his hands in early spring. He no longer expected an answer. It was enough just to speak, to let his words rise into the still air like smoke and disappear. He had built a new shelter by then, one that blended almost entirely into the slope of the hill. From a distance, you could hardly tell where the mountain ended and his home began. The roof curved low, covered in snow and moss, its walls rounded like the hollow of a hand. It was warm, even in the fiercest storm, and when the avalanches came, the snow flowed harmlessly over it, leaving him untouched beneath. Inside, he kept only what he needed: a small stove, a sleeping mat, a few tools, and a shelf carved into the wall where he kept the tokens he had gathered over the years. Each one was a story: a smooth stone from the riverbed, a shard of bone from a caribou, a piece of driftwood shaped like a heart. He never thought of them as possessions. They were reminders that even in solitude, nothing is ever truly alone. Every morning, he followed the same ritual. He stepped outside barefoot for a moment, letting the cold bite into his skin, a quiet reminder that he was alive. Then he fetched water from a stream, its surface frozen except for a small hole he kept open with a stick. He would light the fire, boil tea from pine needles, and watch steam rise through the thin light. There was no rush to begin the day. The day began when the mountain decided. Sometimes he would walk for hours, tracing animal trails or climbing to the ridge where the view stretched beyond sight. Other days, he stayed near the shelter, mending tools or carving small figures from wood, each one a silent conversation between his hands and his thoughts. He spoke rarely now, but when he did, his voice had changed. It was softer, slower, shaped by the rhythm of the place. The mountain had stripped from him all the unnecessary things, the opinions, the arguments, the endless noise of wanting. What remained was simple truth. He no longer felt separate from the world around him. When he breathed, he felt the forest breathe too. When he slept, the snow fell a blanket, and he imagined the earth dreaming with him. He began to notice things most people would never see: the way a snowflake lands on your glove and holds its shape a single second or vanishes, the way the frost on the window glows blue in moonlight, the way silence deepens after a bird takes flight. Each of these moments was a reminder that beauty doesn't need witness to exist. It simply is. He often thought about how humans forget this truth, building their lives around noise and light, needing to prove they're alive through movement. But here, stillness is proof enough. The mountain didn't shout its beauty. It whispered it, patient and eternal. There were days when the loneliness pressed harder, when the silence grew heavy instead of soft. Those were the days he tested himself. He would walk higher into the peak, where the air thinned and the wind cut sharper. Up there, the world was stripped bare of everything human. No footprints, no smoke, sound, just endless white slope his own heart. He liked to think in those moments the edge sacred. It wasn't God, not in the way people spoke of him in churches or towns. It was something older, nameless, vast. The mountain wasn't a deity. It was a reminder of one. It didn't promise salvation, it simply offered truth, and truth was enough. He remembered once climbing to a ledge where he could see the valley stretched below, frozen and perfect. The wind roared around him, tearing at his coat, but he didn't move. He closed his eyes and felt the entire mountain breathing through him, his pulse matching the rhythm of the wind. For a moment, he ceased to exist as a man. He was just part of the landscape: snow, breath, silence, nothing more. When he opened his eyes, tears had frozen on his smile. He understood then that this was what the old hunter had meant when he said, "A house that bows the mountain will live." The same was true for the soul. He found that survival wasn't about endurance, but about intimacy. He learned how to read the snow, to tell from its texture when it was safe to walk and when it hid danger beneath. He learned to feel the storm before it came, not through signs or omens, but through the subtle shift in air pressure that tugged gently at skin. He learned that hunger was not an enemy, teacher. It reminded him how little he needed. Even pain became something to respect. Frostbite, exhaustion, the ache in his hands from chopping wood, they were all part of the same conversation. The mountain spoke through them, asking only that he pay attention. Over time, the boundaries between him and the land dissolved. The fox that visited each morning no longer ran when he approached. The ravens began to follow him on his walks, cawing softly from the trees, keeping him company. He found warmth not in fire alone, but in the rhythm of existence itself. The mountain had accepted him in its quiet way. That was love. Not the kind of love that fills your chest with fire, but the kind that roots you so deeply you no longer fear being alone. On clear nights, he would sit outside wrapped in furs and watch the northern lights ripple the sky. Their colors moved like breathing, green and violet flickering against the dark. He never grew used to them. Each time he saw them, he felt the same awe. The first, they reminded him that wonder was still possible even in solitude, that beauty didn't belong to the crowded world of men. He wondered how many people below ever looked up from their lives long enough to see the sky's own heartbeat. Up here, you couldn't ignore it. It demanded your silence. Sometimes travelers came through, lost trappers or wanderers, and when they found his shelter, they were astonished. They asked how he lived without going mad. He would offer them tea, share what food he had, and listen to their story. They spoke of money, of cities, of plans. He smiled, remembering that language, though it no longer belonged to him. When they left, they always asked the same question, "Aren't you lonely?" He would answer, truthfully, "I am alone, but I am never lonely." Few understood what that meant. They thought loneliness was about people. He knew better. Loneliness is the absence of connection, and he had never been more connected than he was here, connected to the wind, the snow, the stars, and the quiet pulse of the earth beneath his feet. In that silence, he began to rediscover something he hadn't known he'd lost: faith. Not in religion, but in the rhythm of existence itself. He saw how everything, no matter how harsh or brief, had purpose. The storms cleared the skies, the cold preserved life beneath the surface, and even death fed the soil that would bloom again come summer. It was all a cycle, and he was part of it, no different from the fox or the pine. The mountain didn't see him as higher or lower. It simply let him be. That, he realized, was the purest kind of mercy. He often wondered why the settlers of long ago could not understand what the natives had always known. Maybe they were too used to bending the world to their will. Maybe they feared stillness because it forced them to face themselves. But the natives, they had listened. They had learned to build shelters that didn't resist the storm, but welcomed. They had learned to live in harmony, and that their home survived, spirits endured. He thought about that often as he sat by listening to the snow slide soft from the roof. The mountain didn't reward strength. It rewarded respect. The natives had given it that respect, and so, finally, did he. If you've ever longed for quiet, not just the kind that comes when the world stops talking, but the kind that fills you from within, then you already understand a little of this. The silence here is not emptiness. It's present. It's the space where everything makes sense without words. And maybe, just maybe, that's what the world below had forgotten. It was in his fourth winter on the mountain that the challenge came, the kind that tests not the strength of a man's body, but the faith of his soul. By then he had grown so attuned to the rhythms of the land that he believed he could feel every breath the mountain took. He could tell when the snow was ready to fall, when the ice beneath the stream grew thin, when the wind carried change. Yet even that deep knowledge couldn't prepare him for the storm that would arrive one night in early January, a storm unlike any he had ever known. It began with silence, the kind that hums at the edge of perception, heavy and expectant. The air stilled, the sky darkened, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. He knew that silence too well. It was the pause before fury. The ravens vanished from the trees, the fox tracks disappeared from the snow, and even the river stopped whispering. He stepped outside and felt the first gust of wind roll down from the peaks, a slow, deliberate hand brushing across the valley. The storm was coming from the north, the kind that could bury a man alive without leaving a trace. He gathered wood, checked the roof of his shelter, sealed the cracks in the entrance, fed the fire until its glow painted in amber. When the storm hit, It came with a sound like the sky. Snow and wind howled together, shaking the world with raw, relentless power. The shelter trembled under the weight of it, but it held firm, bending as it was meant to. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time lost meaning in that white chaos. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only wind, cold, and darkness pressing from every side. At times, he could hear the mountain groaning deep within itself, like some ancient creature waking. He thought of the old hunter's word, "A house that bows will live," and prayed that he had built deeply enough, gently enough, to deserve that mercy. When the storm finally passed, it left behind a silence deeper than before. A silence. The landscape had changed entirely. Where once there were ridges and trees, now there was only smooth, endless white. The world had been erased, rewritten in snow. He stepped out into it and found that the valley was unrecognizable. Even his own footprints before the storm were gone, as if he had never existed. But his shelter stood untouched, buried deep beneath the snow's curved surface, invisible yet unbroken. He smiled through cracked lips, understanding that this was the mountain's final, the kind that either accepts you or sends you away forever. He had survived not because he fought the storm, but because he had listened to it. But the storm had left behind more than silence. As he climbed higher to see the damage, he noticed something strange in the distance, a glimmer beneath the ice, a faint line of light that pulsed like breath. It was near the edge of a frozen ravine where the snow had shifted and cracked under its own weight. He approached carefully, feeling the snow give way beneath his boots, and there, hidden beneath layers of ice, he found something that didn't belong to the mountain structure, old and nearly devoured by. It was a shelter, but unlike any he had ever seen. Its shape followed the earth, rounded and low. The entrance half collapsed, still visible. He brushed away the snow and saw the marks of tools, not made by machines, but by hand. The walls were of packed snow and ice, layered with driftwood, just as a hunter had once described. But inside the structure was something else entirely. A chamber lined with stones, blackened from fire. He crawled inside, his lantern flickering against the frost, and felt the strange warmth of the place, even after centuries. It was as though the shelter remembered the bodies that had once breathed within it. He sat there for hours, studying every curve. The craftsmanship was perfect. The walls had been shaped so that any weight pressing from above would glide away instead of crushing inward. Air vents were carved through hidden channels that kept the fire's smoke from suffocating those inside. It was not a house. It was an extension of the earth itself. The settlers, he realized, had never truly seen what the natives had built. They had only seen the surface. But this was genius born of patience. It was art, made from survival. He imagined the people who had lived there centuries ago, huddled together while storms like his howled above. He could almost hear their voices, soft and steady, the hum of life continuing beneath the mountain's weight. And he understood then. They hadn't built these shelters out of fear. They had built them out of reverence. To live here was not to endure the mountain, but to join it. Each structure was a promise, a quiet agreement between man and nature that said, "I will not resist and you will not destroy me." It was a covenant of balance, something the world but longed for. He left the ancient shelter untouched, covering it again with snow as though tucking it back to sleep. But he carried its lesson with him. When he returned to his own home, he began to rebuild it from memory, reshaping its form, adjusting every line to match what he had seen. He used the same principle, the curvature of the earth, the even weight of snow, a quiet surrender to pressure instead of defiance. When he finished, he stood outside and watched as the wind flowed over the roof without resistance, the snow settling gently against its side. It was not a structure anymore. It was part of the mountain. That discovery changed him. It wasn't just about shelter. It was about understanding that everything that endures does so through harmony, not power. The natives had known this. The mountain had always known that. It was only man, proud and restless, who had forgotten. He realized that survival was never about mastering the land, but remembering that we belonged to it. In the weeks that followed, he began to explore further, tracing the old paths that the hunter once told him about. He found remnants of other shelters, some almost erased by time, others preserved perfectly beneath layers of ice. Each one told the same story, a people who understood the mountain. In some, he found tools, stone knives, fragments of bone carved into hooks, traces of fire that still marked the rock with soot. He would kneel beside them, touching the cold stones with his bare hands, feeling a quiet connection across centuries. He wasn't alone. He was walking in the footsteps of those who had listened long before him. As the snow began to melt in early spring, he noticed something else. The mountain seemed to breathe differently. Water trickled through new streams, the trees creaked with life, and the air filled with the smell of thawed earth. For the first time, he saw color again, the green of moss, the brown of soil, the deep blue of the sky. The cycle had begun anew. The mountain had forgiven this. One morning, while walking near the river, he found caught in an old trap left by another traveler long ago. Its leg was wounded, but its eyes burned fierce life. He knelt and freed it, speaking softly, though he knew it didn't understand his words. The fox limped away, disappearing into the trees. That small act reminded him compassion was another kind of survival, the kind that keeps the soul from freezing. Out here, kindness wasn't a virtue, it was necessity. The mountain didn't reward cruelty, it punished imbalance. Days later, as he sat outside carving a piece of driftwood, he thought about how everything he had endured, the loss, the solitude, the storms, had not broken him. They had revealed him. He had come to the mountain seeking escape, but what he had found was belonging. He had come to survive, but what he had learned was how to live. The discovery at ancient shelter is more than history. It was a reflection of himself, of what happens when you stop fighting the weight of life and learn to let it rest upon you gently, trusting that it will not crush you, but shape you. The storm that nearly buried him had been his teacher, shelter, his revelation. Together they told him the truth, that life, like the mountain, demands surrender. The more you resist, the more it presses back. But when you learn to yield, to bend, to bow, to listen, you find strength no avalanche can destroy. As he watched the sun sink behind the peaks that evening, painting the sky with fire and frost, he felt something like gratitude. He thought of the settlers who had once doubted the natives knew, who had built their proud cabins only to see them crumble. He wished they could have stood where he stood now, feeling the quiet pulse of the earth at his feet. Perhaps then they would have understood. He knew that someday the mountain would take him too. No man lives forever. But when that day came, he hoped his shelter would remain, curved and silent, another shape in the snow. Maybe someone else would find it, as he had found the old one, and understand. Maybe they would learn what he had learned, that survival is not defiance, but grace. If this story has carried you this far, if you can feel the wind in these words and the weight of the snow in your chest, then remember what the mountain teaches. To live is not to fight the world, but to flow within it. And if you want to hear more of its voice, stay close, subscribe, and let the silence tell you the rest. The longer he lived upon that mountain, the more he came to see the distance between the world he had left behind and the one that existed before him now. At first he thought that difference was measured in miles and seasons, but he came to understand it was measured in silence. Down there, in the towns and cities, silence was something people feared. They filled it with noise, with lights, with endless talking, because silence reminded them of what they didn't want to hear, the sound of themselves. Up here, silence was the only truth that mattered. It wasn't an absence. It was the pulse of the earth itself. It was as though the mountain breathed through the wind, and every snowflake carried its own small piece. He spent long hours reflecting on the life he had once lived. The choices seemed so important then. Money, reputation, approval, all those things that men chase until they what their own hearts sound like. He could see now small they fleeting, how easily they turned to dust the moment the mountain had stripped all of that away from him. And at first, that stripping had felt like death. But in time, he realized that it was rebirth. What had died was the part of him that lived for others' eyes, for the illusion of control. What had survived was something simpler, purer, truer, the man he was meant to be before the noise of life taught him to tend. Sometime the northern lights shimmered above the ridge, and the snow reflected their glow like liquid fire. He would think about the people, their cities glowing brighter every year, their machines humming, their voices loud to drown out stillness bring. He wondered, breathe, not wanting to need explain. He thought of children born into a world where stars were hidden behind smoke, where silence was replaced by screen. He pitied them, not because they lacked comfort, because they lacked emptiness. They would never know what it meant to stand in a place so vast that your thoughts seemed to dissolve into it, to feel the humility of knowing the earth could erase you in an instant, and yet somehow chooses not to. He realized in those long reflections that the greatest tragedy of mankind was not its violence or its greed. It was its forgetfulness. Somewhere along the line, man had forgotten that he belongs to the same cycle as the soil and the wind. He began to think of the mountain not just as a home, but as a mirror held up to the world. In its slopes, he saw both beauty and warning. The snow was pure, but beneath it was danger. The cold was cleansing, but it could kill as easily
Nature
as
was
it
not
could
cruel.
preserve. It was honest, and honesty, he thought, was what humanity feared most. He would sometimes sit by the fire and speak aloud, as if talking to the mountain itself. He asked it questions he could never have asked another person. Why do men destroy what they love? Why do they build walls around themselves and call it safety? Why do they fear silence when it is the only thing that never lies? The mountain never answered with words, but its silence always gave him what
In
he
that
needed.
silence,
He began to understand that there are no answers, only understanding, and understanding is enough. He began to write again, carving words into pieces of driftwood, burning thoughts into the soft bark of fallen trees, not for anyone else, not for posterity, but for the sake of memory itself. He wrote about what he saw, the fox crossing the valley at dawn, the sound of ice breaking on the river in spring, the way his breath made small vanish to air. He wrote about the old shelter he had found, about the wisdom of those who came before. He wrote about fear, not as an enemy, but as a teacher. And as he wrote, he realized something that startled him. He was not alone in his solitude. The whole mountain was alive with presence. Every sound, every movement, every shift of light was a reminder that life continued in quiet ways beyond human noise. When the snow melted and summer came, brief, bright, and fierce, he wandered through the meadows where wild flowers painted the ground. He saw bees, small, tireless, moving through the blossoms, and he thought about how even here, where the air was thin and the winters cruel, life persisted. It didn't fight to exist, it simply did. There was no pride in it, no ambition, no noise, just being. He realized the truest wisdom lay not in conquering, but in imitating, to live quietly, to endure gently, to bloom briefly, but beautifully. That was enough. He thought about how different the world might be if people understood this, if instead of building higher towers, they built deeper roots, if instead of trying to own the world, they tried to listen to it. He sometimes imagined cities gone silent a single day. No engine, no talking, no screen, just the sound of wind moving through empty. Would people hear themselves again, or would the silence terrify them? He thought it might save them if they only allowed it. One day, as autumn began to return, he watched a storm forming far to the west. It wasn't coming toward him. It was moving along the horizon, dark and vast, thunder rolling like a heartbeat through the sky. He watched it for hours, and in that storm, he saw a reflection of humanity itself, restless, loud, consuming everything in its path, but still beautiful in its own wild way. The storm wasn't evil. It was part of the balance, and maybe mankind was too. Maybe even their noise had its place in the great rhythm of the world. The thought comforted him. It reminded him that even imperfection could belong. He began to see his isolation not as separation from humanity, but as connection to it from a different angle. The world needed people like him, not many, just a few, to remember what others forgot. People to listen, to observe, to carry silence like a seed, and when the time came, let it grow again where it was most needed. He thought that perhaps that was why he had been called to the mountain, not to escape, but to preserve something precious for a world that no longer had time to remember it. Sometimes he wondered if others like him still existed, men and women scattered across wildernesses, living quiet, keeping the old rhythm alive. He liked to imagine them on other peaks, in deserts and forests, tending their fires and listening to the earth the way he did. Maybe they were part of the same silent tribe, a brotherhood without names, bound by nothing but the understanding that peace is not something you find, it's something you remember. One night, while the moon hung low and red over the ridge, he sat outside and watched the mist roll through the valley. The air smelled of pine and cold water. He thought of the woman he had lost, of the world he had left, of the storms he had survived. He felt no regret, no anger, no loneliness, just gratitude. The mountain had not made him a different man. It had made him whole. It had stripped away everything false until only the truth remained. And that truth was simple. Man belongs to the earth, not the other way around. As he sat there, he thought of how settlers long ago had looked at the natives with disbelief, thinking them primitive for bowing to the mountain instead of defying it. And yet, it was their humility that kept them alive. He thought of how many times history had repeated that same mistake, men mistaking surrender for weakness, reverence for ignorance, silence for emptiness. He smiled, realizing that the mountain would outlive all. The storms would come and go, the ice would rise and melt, silence would remain, and maybe that was how it should be. He closed his eyes and listened to the wind. It moved softly through the trees, carrying with it faint sound eternal. He realized that the mountain had taught him everything he needed to know about life, that nothing is permanent, that beauty is born from balance, and that the greatest strength a man can have is the ability to yield. The world below might never understand that truth, but perhaps someday someone would come seeking it again, another soul weary of noise, hungry for stillness, and when they did, the mountain would be waiting, patient as always. He whispered into the night, "We never truly escape the world. We just find the quiet places where we can see it more clearly." His words vanished into the air, but he knew they would linger, woven into the wind, carried through the valleys like everything else that lives on long after the man who speaks it is gone. If you're still listening, if these words find you somewhere between noise and silence, remember this: the mountain is not far away. It exists wherever you let the world grow quiet enough to hear your own breath again. It's not a place, it's a way of seeing. If you can find that stillness, even for a moment, you'll understand what he found up there. And if you want to keep walking with him through that, stay, listen, and subscribe, because the mountain still has more to teach. Years passed without his notice. The seasons turned quietly, the way they always had. Winter folding into thaw, spring stretching toward the fragile summer, and then the slow golden fade of autumn before the snow returned to claim everything once more. He no longer counted years, nor marked time in any way that mattered to me. His beard had gone white, his hands were slower, but his eyes were still clear, steady as the frozen lake at dawn. The mountain had aged with him. though it showed no sign of it. It remained as it always was, immense, eternal, indifferent, yet strangely kind. He had come here once as a stranger. Now he was part of its memory. The valley knew him. The ravens no longer startled when he passed. The foxes left prints near his door. Even the wind seemed to know him. He often wondered if this was the old hunter, woven so deeply into the mountain's rhythm that leaving it feel like tearing away a part of him. But he had no desire to leave. The mountain had given him everything a man could hope to find: peace, purpose, and truth. What more could he ask for? His shelter had become a part of the landscape now. From a distance it was indistinguishable from the slope itself. Moss covered its sides, snow curved naturally over its roof, and in summer wild flowers grew along its edges. Inside it was simple and warm. The fire pit glowed softly, and the air always smelled faintly of pine and smoke. His tools hung neatly where they belonged. His few possessions were arranged not by value, but by meaning. The driftwood figures, the pouch of stones, the feather from the raven that had once landed on his shoulder. Each one was a story, a whisper of all that had. He spent his days as he always had, fetching water, mending, walking, listening. But in his later years, he began to think more about what he would leave behind, not in the way men usually mean when they speak of legacy. No monuments, no written words, no names carved into stone, but in the quieter sense of what endures in silence. He wondered if the mountain would remember him the way he remembered the old shelter he'd found long ago. Perhaps someday another wanderer would stumble upon his home, half buried in snow, and feel that same strange recognition, that sense of belonging to something greater, something patient enough to outlive memory. He liked that thought. There was no fear of death in him, only curiosity. He had seen too much of the mountain's balance to think of death and ending. He had watched animals fall and feed the soil, seen snow melt into rivers, rivers rise to clouds return as snow. It was all one circle, one endless rhythm. Should he be any different? The body would return to the earth, the spirit, silence, and both would go on in ways mine. The mountain would take him, as it took everything, not cruelly, but naturally. One morning in late winter, he woke to a stillness deeper than any he had ever felt. The air was clear, the sky pale, the snow untouched. It was as though the world had paused just for him. He stepped outside, his breath rising in slow cloud, and looked toward them. They stood sharp and shining, the sun breaking over them like gold spilling across glass. He knew then, without words, that his time, there was no sadness in it, only completion. He felt as though he had walked to the edge of something vast, and now it was time to step across. He spent that day preparing, not for an ending, but for a return. He cleaned the shelter, stacked the firewood, and arranged his small tokens in neat line by the wall. He left a bowl of dried berries by the door for the fire and scattered a few crumbs for the bird. As night came, he lit the last fire he would ever make and sat before it, watching the flames dance. He spoke softly to the woman he had loved, to the mountain that had held him, to the silence that had talked. "I came here to escape," he said, "but I found a home instead. I thought I had lost everything, but it was only the noise I lost. What remained was the truth." When the fire dimmed, he lay down, closed. The wind moved gently outside, carrying snowflakes against the roof, and in that whispering sound he heard the voices of all who had come before. The old hunter, the native builders, the ones who had listened instead. He smiled because he understood now that he was joining them. The mountain does not keep the dead. It carries them, scatters them through the trees, the rivers, the storm. It was not an ending. It was belonging. When spring came again, the snow melted over his shelter, sank. The entrance filled with drift, and wildflowers bloomed along the edges where his hands had once worked the earth. The ravens still flew above, calling softly as they passed. The fox returned to sniff at the doorway, finding the scent familiar but no longer knew why. Everything went on. The mountain remembered, as it always. Years later, long after his name was forgotten, travelers would sometimes find trace, a curved structure buried beneath carved snow, figure smoothed by time, a hearthstone blackened by ancient fire. They would wonder who had lived there, how he had survived. What kind of man could endure such solitude? Some would say he must have been mad, others that he was a prophet, but the mountain not answer. It would only keep its, and in that silence, all the truth they sought was already waiting, because the mountain does not explain. It shows. It shows strength is not in resistance, but in yielding, that love does not die. It changes shape. It moves like wind through the pines. It shows that death is not departure, but return. These were the lessons he had lived and left behind, not written in books, carved into the very rhythm of the land. Sometimes, during great storms, when avalanches roared down the slopes, the snow would slide smoothly over that hidden shelter without breaking it. The mountain still honored the covenant. What bows will live. The settlers of long ago could not understand that truth, but the land remembered, and in remembering, it passed it forward. The old wisdom never truly died. It sleeps beneath the snow, waiting for those who will listen. And so his legacy was not his name, nor his story, but his silence. It was the quiet reminder that man and nature are not enemies, that solitude is not emptiness, and that peace is not found in the absence of struggle, but in the acceptance. He had become part of the mountain's language, wordless, eternal, unbroken. If you were to walk there now, through the valley where he once lived, you might feel something in the air you can't explain. You might stop and look at the way the wind moves across snow, at the curve of the slope, at the faint outline of a buried roof beneath. You might feel a kind of calm you haven't known in years, the kind that makes you breathe slower, the kind that makes you... And if you listen long enough, you might hear it too, the quiet voice of the mountain whispering through the silence, telling you that you belong here, that you always... He is gone, but his story remains as wind. It lingers in the snow, in the tree, in the patient rhythm of the world. It reminds those who pass that survival is not a battle to be won, but a dance to be remembered. The native knew it. The old hunter knew it, and he came to know it too. The mountain endures because it bends. The man endures because he learns to bow. That is the legacy of silence. So if this story has found you wherever you are, in the noise of the city or the quiet of your own thoughts, take a moment now. Close, breathe, listen. The mountain's silence is not far. It waits spaces between your heart. In the moments when the world grows still, carry that silence. Let it remind you that peace does not come from leaving everything behind. It comes from belonging completely to the moment you're in. And if the story of this man, his mountain, and his silence has touched, then let the legacy continue. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below telling where in the world you are listening from. Let others know how the mountain's voice sounds where you stand. Subscribe, stay, and let the silence live a little longer. Because somewhere out there, above the snow and the wind, the mountain is still watching, still waiting, still speaking softly to anyone who dares.